we're gonna be hitting the quagmires. We're gonna get deep into the woods here, into the weeds, into the papyrus. Okay, you can't really avoid it in this book, and today is more of the same with Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. But before we begin, one of the emails I got, it prompted me to. I thought it'd be a good idea to spend a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes here, commenting on some previous content. I got a question or an email, a comment from Chris, who's an archaeologist and a specialist in historical geography of the Bible at Bar Ilan University in Israel. And he wrote me and he said, just basically, I'm not going to go through the whole email, but he said, I've heard Jim Hoffmeyer from Wheaton, who's an Egyptologist, and of course has the very useful book, Israel in Egypt, the evidence for the authenticity of the Exodus tradition, which I have referenced in the earlier episodes a bit. Chris says, I've heard Hoffmeyer talk about the textual updating idea of Chuck Ayling. For those who have listened to the first 2 episodes on chapter 1, you know what we're talking about here. And Hoffmeyer, he said, counters that it is problematic for Avaris to have been updated to Ramses or Raamses when Ramses was only a major Egyptian town until the 20th dynasty. A late updating during the presumed editorial activity for the Pentateuch, which is the exile or shortly thereafter, would be centuries later, centuries after the 20th dynasty. And so Chris says it wouldn't mean anything to later Israelites who would not be aware of a city named Ramses or Raamses. In Psalm 78, again, we have a reference to Zoan, which is actually a later name of the same place, or at least the same region that we're talking about here. So he says, in other words, if Ayling's editorial activity is coherent, again, a scribe would have updated the name from Avaris to Zoan, not Raamses. Now, a couple comments here. That of course is coherent, as it's stated, but there are 2 possible responses to it. Again, just so that you get the idea that Chris is raising here. If it's true that the place, we're talking about these 2 store cities in Exodus 1:11, Pithom and Raamses to be more precise. And we talked during our chronology episode that the early daters address this or get around it by proposing that Raamses as a name is an editorial updating, again, when the Pentateuch was edited and updated. And there are other examples of this. Bethel, Luz is a good example, very transparent in Scripture. And so they postulate this kind of thing happened. And so Raamses in Exodus 1:11 does not force a late date for the Exodus, something in the 1200s. Of course, the early date is the one that takes 1 Kings 6:1 literally, and that's the mid-1400s BC. So the fact that Raamses is in there and his time period is in the 1200s BC, that doesn't force us to say the Exodus was dated to that time. Raamses could have just wound up in the text because of this editorial updating during the exile or shortly thereafter, the 500s, we'll call it, BC. And Chris's point is that, well, that wouldn't make sense because if they were updating the text then, they would have used Zoan instead of Raamses. So again, there are a couple possible responses to this. And Redford's article that we talked about when we discussed Exodus 1:11 notes this on page 402. The presumed editor you could still have an editor in the 500s BC, still inserting or using Raamses deliberately to give the story an archaic flavor. To some listening, that would just seem like fictionalizing something or playing a little too fast and loose with the editorial idea. That the writer knows that, well, the city's called Zoan now, but we're going to call it Raamses, to take, to sort of get back to the original antiquity, of the Exodus event and preserve that then. Again, that might sound like fictionalizing. The problem with sort of looking at it that way, this possibility, is books like Job. I mean, Job has a mix, and everybody, all scholars who study Job know this. It has a mix of late Hebrew features and early, not only a few early Hebrew features or earlier Hebrew features, but the book itself is set in a patriarchal setting. So you could have a writer writing late, again, 500s BC, and putting things into the story to, give it an archaic flavor. Of course, the problem with that is that people would say, well, Job can get away with that because it's wisdom literature. Exodus is historical, and so that we feel less comfortable there. Again, I understand that, but go back to our very first episode when we jumped into the book of Exodus. We asked questions like, well, how much precision do we need to be precise or to call something history? I mean, ancient books, ancient writers do this sort of thing. And even though we wouldn't do it the way we write history now, they did do this sort of thing. So the fact that they do it doesn't rule out historicity. I mean, in Job's case, there really could have been a person named Job, who suffered and so on and so forth. And then, his reason for suffering gets, theological dimensions because, of how the book begins and theologizing his suffering. So it doesn't rule out Job's historicity. And that's just the way the book is crafted. In other words, the ancient person wouldn't have read that and concluded just out of the gate, well, there was never really somebody named Job, and we know this is just sort of an allegory. Now, a lot of people would have thought there was a person named Job, and then they're getting a behind-the-scenes look in the spiritual world about why this guy is suffering when he's righteous. So the fact that this can happen doesn't rule out historicity. So that's the first approach, that a writer could still have used Ramses and, to give it an archaic flavor. Second, is the longer one. Redford, of course, again, we referenced his article on Exodus 1:11. Redford, listeners should know by this point, doesn't buy Hofmeier's argument that since Ramses was only a major town until the 20th dynasty, the editorial updating must have been at the time of Ramses or shortly thereafter, like 12th, 11th century BC. Redford doesn't buy it because he questions whether the name itself refers to the town specifically, as opposed to merely associating the store cities with Ramses, the person. And Redford marshals evidence for the imprecision of equating the name with the actual city or residence. He actually says in a different article, this is actually Redford in Anchor Bible Dictionary, he says it's important since Zoan became the official pharaonic residence, replacing the old Ramesside capital, P. Rameses. And then again, he's going to go on in what he writes to distinguish the sort of the place regionally and the person Ramses from the actual residence, the town and the residents within the town. So Redford doesn't view all these things as sort of a whole. He divides up the parts and then he asks the question, does the name is it really about the city, the place? Again, that Hofmeier would say, well, it is about the city, and it was only the royal residence there until the 20th dynasty. So Redford sort of out of the gate, it just looks at it, approaches it from a different trajectory. He asks, again, Redford asks in his article on Exodus 1:11, is the name Ramses in Exodus 1:11 to be equated with Ramses II's capital? Again, the specific site. He doesn't think so. Again, we noted that in the earlier episode, and Redford goes on. And here's one of his arguments. Is it not strange that if the two Egyptian toponyms, place names, were borrowed around 1200 BC by the Hebrews, that the element per in per ra mes su, that's the Egyptian spelling for that one, and per atom for pithom. He says, doesn't it seem strange that the two Egyptian toponyms were borrowed? If they were borrowed, the element per should be retained in per atom, which is pithom, but suppressed or done away with in per ra mes su. You don't get pith Ramses, you just get Ramses. You don't get any of that first syllable is gone. So Redford thinks, again, that's just strange. Why keep it with one and not the other? And this is what prompts him to argue that the Hebrew spelling without that per element actually is the result of getting the place name or the name, the name of the person, from Greek material, which is very late. Again, so this is the logic that Redford uses. Something I didn't get into in the last episode, or the episode we did on chronology. Redford continues. He says this idea, the idea of very late updating, agrees, with other things. Specifically, it agrees with the fact that from the Saite period well on into Roman times, there was a flourishing city called Pithom in the northeastern delta, while there is no evidence that prior to the Saites, which are very late, there's no evidence prior to them that a city named Pithom ever existed in Egypt. Now that creates a problem because when you read Exodus 1:11, we're talking about the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. So Redford's going to say, look, just the fact that historically we don't get a city known as Pithom until very late. He says that bolsters his argument about what to do with Ramses. Again, very late editorial kind of activity. So, Redford is going to object, to this, and we really get down to the question of how do we get Pithom as a store city, and how can we reconcile that with all that we've said about Ramses? So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but for Chris, and this is kind of geeking out here a little bit. I wish that Hofmeyr had dealt, with some of the contentions of Redford. He deals with some, but he leaves some out. Hofmeyr does cite the work of a couple other scholars who object to Redford's idea that Ramses did not refer to the capital itself. That's true. With respect to both the name Ramses, Hofmeyr objects, rightly in my mind, as something we're going to talk about today. We'll get into this. Hofmeyr objects to Redford's argument that Ra-mes-su is different than Ramses because of the spelling. And there's really two elements to Redford's argument there. One is the S letter is different in Egyptian and Hebrew. And also there's a whole other syllable that's missing, Ra-mes, as opposed to Ra-mes-su. There's that syllable that's missing. The S syllable talk isn't really that important, so I agree with Hofmeyr that that's not much of an argument. But the missing syllable Hofmeyr never addresses. And that's important to what Redford is saying. So again, Redford just approaches this from a different perspective. And you could say, well, where does this leave us? Well, as always, with not being able to prove either date by means of Exodus 1:11. That's just the way it is. You can go back and forth with all these detailed arguments, But to be fair, the late date isn't undone by the editorial updating issue. It just, you can argue till you're blue in the face about minutia like letters and syllables in names, and whether the S sound in Egyptian has more than one S sound, and Hebrew has two. Sibilants in linguistic talk. Egyptian actually has several, actually has more than two. Hebrew has two. So the fact that, they're inconsistently used when a place name goes from one language to the other and from that other language back to Egyptian, what do we do with that stuff? But that's the level of argumentation you get on this verse, Exodus 1:11, within the bigger debate of the date of the Exodus. I mean, it's so granular. It's so detailed. And this is why, again, we're going to move on to what we're covering today, but this is why I hope this sort of mind-numbing stuff illustrates something that you should be suspicious when you read something on the internet or something that's not peer-reviewed material, claiming to solve the date of the Exodus or claiming to locate a specific biblical site with, this particular thing over here. And, this is so obvious. All we got to do is visit there. All we got to do is look at this. All we got to do is think this thought and the problem's solved. No, it isn't. These debates are centuries old for a reason, actually for many reasons. It gets very granular, very detailed in terms of linguistic evidence, archaeological evidence. Arguments hinge. They move one way or the other based on minutia. And if you're reading something that has not considered the minutia and interacted with peer-reviewed material that does interact with the minutia, feel free to dismiss it. Okay, it is just not up to snuff. If you're going to be serious about research, you must interact with the minutia. Otherwise, you're going to overlook something and make fallacious arguments. So let's just take the granular level of the detail here as kind of a learning tool about how biblical studies is done, and that we should not just, all commentary about a subject is not equal. It just isn't. People with a high degree of expertise have considered all the things that need to be considered over and over and over again, and they have interacted with other people just like them. So when you get researchers and writers who don't do any of that work, aren't even really aware of that work, don't just adopt what they say. Realize that there are reasons why these debates have persisted. It's not easy. It just isn't. So today we're in Exodus 2:1-10. I'm going to read the passage, and we're going to get into sort of a big item and then a smaller item. in the episode today, but we want to start off by reading the actual passage. And we're going to go through the first 10 verses, and there's a lot to consider here. There's just, again, it's Exodus. There's just so many things going on here. And, some things that might appear a bit obvious. Hey, I want to drill down on that. I'm curious about this thing that I can see clearly. And then there are other things that are sort of lurking in the background that you may or may not be aware of that are really crucial, again, to the way academics, the way scholars think about Exodus 2, 1 through 10. So, reading from ESV, we read this. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister, the child's sister, said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And the Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now, again, this is a very familiar story. I think the basic elements of this are frankly pretty obvious. So, we're not terribly concerned about sort of retelling the story and doing, kind of a sermon, some sort of sermonic material on. What I want to drill down on are two things. Again, one of them is kind of obvious, the other's not. We're going to do the non-obvious first because it's the longest and it's probably the most challenging. And then at the end, the second part, we'll do that then. The second one, the one that's sort of easier, is what about the name Moses? How does that work with Egyptian? Does it make sense? And that's something that always comes up. You read books about Exodus or the Old Testament, Israel and Egypt, and you get that sort of discussion. Depending on what kind of books, though, you're reading, if you have studied Exodus on your own, you may or may not hit the first topic we're going to consider the big one. And that is, there's a genre, a literary issue here. Specifically, there are two aspects to this. When I say a literary or a genre issue, there are a lot of other stories, a lot of them, that feature an abandoned child or an abandoned hero who, in some instances, the circumstances are very similar to what you read in Exodus 2. And then this abandoned child, grows up and does great things. Now, there are a lot of these stories. I'm going to reference yet another article by Redford. Again, Redford is an Egyptologist, so he has taken an interest in Egyptian stuff in the book of Exodus. That's why we're referring to his material more than once. But there's one specific story that has the closest parallels to Exodus 2:10. And I'm going to give you the title of that story now, and we'll get into it as we proceed here. But that is the Sargon birth legend. Now, if you're doing your research on the internet, you're going to read things like the writer of Exodus copied the Sargon birth legend to create the story of Moses in Exodus 2. Again, I think that's drastically overstated, but that's what you get on the internet. But we need to get into the subject, and I think you'll see, why pretty quickly. So I'm going to be referencing, when I say Redford's article on the exposed child or the abandoned child, the article I'm referring to is, again, by Donald Redford. It's entitled "The Literary Motif of the Exposed Child, Exodus 2, 1 through 10. And this is from the scholarly journal Newman. It's Numen, volume 14, number 3. It was written in 1967, pages 209 to 228. Now, what Redford does in this is he marshals all of the similar stories that in some way feature a child, a baby, that is abandoned or put under threat, basically disposed of in some way, and collects those and then makes some comparative comments uh, in relationship to Exodus as part of the article. The entire article doesn't focus on the comparison. What he does is he groups the stories into sort of three categories. And his three themes, or his three thematic categories, are: number one, you have stories where the child is exposed through shame at some circumstance of birth, like maybe the child's illegitimate, maybe the child has a deformity, maybe the child is a quote unquote hybrid. In other words, the offspring of a god coming down and copulating with a woman or raping a woman. There are some Greek stories like that. So the child is a product of a rape, that sort of thing. So that's the first kind of theme, the thematic element of his three. Now, Redford provides 14 examples, two of which have a box or container being put into water. The baby or the child is put into this container and put into the water as an element. But the stories in this category, this isn't actually where Redford puts the Moses story, because the other features of the stories in this category are honestly pretty bizarre. You've got the infant being suckled by a bear or a wolf or a cow, to keep it alive. And you got other really just truly bizarre sorts of elements. But two of them, at least two of the 14, have this box or container in water. That was the method of disposal of the child. And I hope you're catching that I'm saying disposal, because that is going to be a point of disconnect with the Exodus story. The mother of Moses in the Exodus 2 story isn't trying to just dispose of him. There's no shame here. Again, this is part of why Redford does not include the Exodus story in this first category. But again, you'll see on the internet some of these examples that are plucked out, and one of them is the Sargon birth legend. Sargon is an illegitimate child. So that's a big disconnect with what's going on in the book of Exodus, just out of the gate. So much so that, again, Redford's not an evangelical Christian. He's got no Christian or inspiration axe to grind. He just doesn't see the similarity here with the Sargon birth legend. But that's sort of the go-to analogy on the internet and in other popular resources for the origin of the Moses story. But again, here we have a good example of Redford saying, not really. There's just too much that's different here. Now, the second category is that someone in power wants the child dead. And Redford provides 13 examples here, 3 of which, again, have this container or the water thread. Now, this one, this one applies, to Exodus 2 because the baby, Moses, is under threat. His life is at stake here because of the, killing off the male children that we've talked about before. So this category fits, and again, you have 3 examples where you've got, the container and the water. But Redford opts for category 3 to sort of, this is his best, in his view, the best, analogy, or at least the right category for Exodus 2. And that is, there's a general massacre going on that endangers the child. And Redford gives us 5 examples of the abandoned child motif that include this element. And so this really speaks to him as being the closest sort of circumstance to the Moses story. And so this is where he'll actually list the Moses story in his article. Interestingly enough, he also puts the Jesus story in this one. You remember when Jesus was taken to Egypt to flee, Herod wants all the boys from 2 years old and under to die. So Redford, again, interestingly enough, puts the Jesus story in the same category. Now that gives us a total of 32 stories with at least some similarity. And you've got, again, 5 or 6, you just call it half dozen, that have this container and water thing going on, which is, again, a big part of the Exodus 2 story. But of the 32, we should also mention that fewer than half of them involve mere human children. That means more than half of these stories concerns a child fathered illegitimately by a divine being or a rape. And the Moses story clearly does not fit that. So, right away we've got that raises a question mark over the idea. Well, did the biblical writer know a bunch of these stories and then want to pattern his story deliberately after them? Well, a lot of them, if he was doing that, why not have an angel coming and saying, hey, you're going to have a kid, his name's going to be Moses, and this and that's going to happen? Kind of like the Jesus story, okay? Why don't we have some sort of divine appearance or input or something going on? Like with Samson. Samson isn't part of this discussion here, but the angel of the Lord shows up and announces to Samson's parents they're going to have a child. It's just something like that. We don't get that in Exodus 2. So it's a significant disconnect. There's no reason to conclude Moses is anything else but a normal human baby. So over half the examples, again, have a significant disconnection with what's going on in Exodus 2. Now, Redford, again, is obviously well aware of this, and we know where he puts it. He puts it in the third category. And he knows that other scholars have tried to argue that Exodus 2, is an adaptation of this or that specific story. Since he's an Egyptologist, he spends a lot of time in this article discussing the birth of Horus. And again, he devotes a good bit of attention to, as an Egyptologist, why the birth of Horus doesn't really provide a good literary analogy, does not, again, provide a good literary analogy with the Exodus 2 story. And he's also going to reject, the Sargon story, but we'll get to that in a moment. Redford goes through the birth story of Horus, and he rejects, again, the alleged Egyptian antecedents to the Moses story as source parallels. Specifically, he notes that the parallels to the birth of Horus, there is a craft, a little boat or whatever of papyrus made of reeds. The child is hidden in a marsh. There's a villain bent on the death of the child. He notes those elements are there, but he points out that those elements of the Horus, birth story, come from a very late, set of texts, very late versions from the Greco-Roman period. And so Redford actually argues that the writers of the Horus, myth were very likely familiar with the Moses story. And it could have, been fertilized the other way around. Redford is pretty transparent about that, with the chronology of the text. And so for those listening, I wanted to mention that because again, there's a lot of internet stuff, zeitgeist. Zeitgeist is typically trying to say, Jesus is Horus or whatever. But you're going to run into this as well, with the Moses story. It's just taken from the Horus story, and Moses is like a, archetypal for Jesus, and so that's why Jesus, gets to be a rehash of Horus. It breaks down, and you even have Egyptologists that just say, well, if we're honest here, the material is really late, and so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, as it pertains to our subject here in Exodus 2. Now, where we want to camp, though, is really the Sargon birth story. So I'm going to read you a summary of the elements here from Redford's article. And specifically, this article of Redford is the one about the abandoned child motif. And so on page 214, in Redford's first category, he lists the Sargon story. And it goes like this, just a little paragraph. He says, Sargon is born in secret into a family which has apparently been at home in upland country. His birthplace, however, is a city on the Euphrates, where his mother puts him in a reed ark and casts it upon the river. Found by a drawer of water, Sargon is brought up as his son. Although no reason is given for the secrecy of the birth, it is clear that it was interdicted by someone. Sargon was probably not the object of a jealous king's search, but simply the bastard offspring of a woman whose station in life condemned her to childlessness. Then he has a footnote where he discusses that. But for our purposes here, there's this thing out there in Akkadian literature, Akkadian and Assyrian Mesopotamian literature, called the Sargon birth legend. And it has these elements. Sargon, little baby, put into a reed box or ark, little boat made of reeds, cast into the river, found by somebody coming down to draw water, and then Sargon, grows up to be this great king, the Sargon the Great. And this is centuries, Sargon, at least Sargon the Great, that person lived centuries before, the Israelites were in Egypt, centuries before Moses. Now the question is, though, how old are the texts? we're going to get into that because the person that we know from Mesopotamian history is that's one thing, but then what's written about that person is quite another. When you run into these texts, not just Mesopotamian texts, but Egyptian and biblical texts, I mean, you have to ask yourself, well, is the writing contemporaneous with the person that we're reading about? We talked about Job a few minutes ago. Job is set in the patriarchal era, but again, by virtue of the language used throughout the book, it's much later. We have these sorts of situations where the biblical content is written centuries after the fact of what's being described, and that's normal. Again, it's ubiquitous actually in antiquity. There's nothing unusual about that. So again, just a heads up that when we talk about Sargon the person living at a certain specific time well before Moses, that's different than talking about the literary text or texts from which we get the Sargon birth story. Okay, they're not contemporaneous in terms of time. Now, the elements, again, are kind of obvious. And this has become sort of a big topic of discussion, in popular biblical studies. And I use the internet for an example where you get some good stuff and you get some really ridiculous stuff too. There's a dissertation on this subject that is fairly old. It was done in 1976. And it's by a guy named Brian Lewis. It's called The Legend of Sargon, A Study of the Akkadian Text and the Tale of the Hero Who Was Exposed at Birth. The dissertation was done at NYU, New York University, again, 1976. And this is the most detailed study of the Sargon birth legend. Goes through just every aspect of this. And on pages 182 to 184, Lewis writes a few things that I think are really worth pointing out, worth quoting, that sort of gets us into that. So the question before us is, okay, the Exodus 2 story is very similar to a bunch of these abandoned child stories, but a lot of them can sort of be winnowed out by one or more factors. And the one that everybody seems to zero in on is this one about Sargon, because the elements are close. We have text to this effect. Redford again is weeding out the Horus story because the textual material is so late. It's basically so late it's irrelevant. So what we're really left with as sort of the primary point of attention is this Sargon story. So that's why we're going to spend some time on it. So we're going to go through some thoughts that Lewis in his dissertation shared, and then just think ourselves about, well, what do we do with this? So Lewis writes, in considering the problem of determining the date of composition, when the Sargon legend was written. When we're considering that problem, one is faced with a long period during which the genre to which the text belongs was alive, and little, if any, obvious internal criteria with which to fix a date. Okay? So right away, Lewis is admitting, again, this is the most detailed study of the Sargon legend in the Akkadian, in the original texts that we have. He's like, basically, we can't fix a date. He continues and says, it may in fact be impossible to establish with any certainty the origins of the Sargon legend based on the available evidence. The text lacks any obvious grammatical, lexicographical, or philological feature which would allow a precise dating. Unfortunately, aside from its possible mention in two inventories of texts from Kujundjik, which is, again, a location in Mesopotamia, there are no known references to the Sargon legend in all of cuneiform literature. The copies whose fragments we possess are relatively late. 3 fragments belonging to the Kujundjik collection are written in Neo-Assyrian script, and a 4th fragment written in Neo-Babylonian is probably even later. Now, let me stop there. Neo-Assyrian is going to be 900, 800, 700 BC. Okay, it is not, if Sargon goes back to the 24th, 23rd centuries BC, you're dealing with well over 1,500 years later is what the text dates to. So again, the person Sargon the Great, again, you can fix a date based on cuneiform literature, Sumerian, Mesopotamian literature, Old Babylonian stuff, Old Akkadian stuff. We know when this guy lived. But this legend that's written about him is 1,500 years at least later in terms of the text we have. And if you're looking at Assyrian dates, this is actually going to be after even critical scholar datings for the E material. Okay, Exodus is considered E, JEDP. The whole back to the whole theory of the Pentateuch. So if you believe in Mosaic authorship, I mean, there's no question. It's either 1400 BC or 1200 BC. Again, centuries earlier than the Sargon birth legend. If you, again, go with JEDP, it's still a century or two earlier than the Sargon stuff, than the Assyrian period. So right away, we have a chronological problem for trying to say that the writer of Exodus 2 used the Sargon birth legend. If you're going with the text we actually have, that is an impossible argument to be that specific. Okay, it's an argument that just can't be made on the basis of data, which means if you're going to make that argument, you're making it up. You're just going with it without data. That's just the way it is. Now back to Lewis. He says, the question is, are these late copies of a text which had originated at a much earlier period? So he says, what we have is late, but the question is, are they copies of a much older text that we no longer have? Again, that's an open question. So are these late copies of a text which had originated at a much earlier period, or perhaps the remnants of a late composition which may have only been loosely based on earlier sources of some kind? Now we have seen that the use of the royal epithet Sharu Danu, strong king, in line 1, is an anachronism in a text attributed to Sargon of Agade, or Agade if you want to anglicize it here, Agade. For the first occurrence is to be found in the 8th regnal year of Amar Sin, 2039 BC of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, and thus follows by 240 years the end of Sargon's rule. Therefore, the ascription of the title to Sargon in this work proves that the legend was written after 2039 and establishes, at least that much. The presence of copies in the library of Assurbanipal, whose dates are 668 to 627 BC, provides kind of the latest point. So you have kind of an earliest point, terminus postquem, and then you have the latest point, terminus antequem of the mid-7th century. But all the tablets we actually have are in that Assyrian period, the 800s, 700s, 600s BC. And what that last comment was about is even some titles, some in this case this one phrase. Yeah, the phrase shows up in these earlier texts, but Lewis is saying that Assyriologists think that it's a deliberate anachronism, that some later writer just used it again to give it the appearance of age. Just like we were talking about, earlier with, Ramses. Writers do this in the ancient world. They pluck out phrases and titles and descriptive elements from texts that they know of because they're scribes that are much older, and they'll stick them in later texts, the ones they're actually writing. Could be at 1,500, 2,000 years later, and they'll use these older lines, older words and things like that, just to give it the flavor of antiquity. But in this case, there's only one of them. Again, there are some other things that Lewis goes through, and the Assyriological community, those who are experts in cuneiform literature, recognize all of these as being anachronistic. They don't help. They don't move the tablet back, because if it's discovered, in a particular library or a particular pile of cuneiform tablets that clearly date to the Assyrian period, and the script itself, the cuneiform script itself, changes over time. Even though cuneiform looks like chicken scratch, the chicken scratch of one era looks different than the chicken scratch of another. Again, and people who are into cuneiform understand that. They can see it. They create, or they have typologies, for all of this kind of stuff. The texts are late, is the point. And the question of, are they copies of something that was earlier? Well, we don't know. You can make that argument. So what Lewis does in his dissertation from this point on, from about page 184 on, is he imagines a scenario for an early origin of the story. Again, texts we don't have, but he imagines how this might have worked, how you could make the argument. And then he is fair in his dissertation, and he imagines how you would understand how things would have worked in a late period. Now, there are 2 points I think that are worth pointing out as well, before we leave Lewis's dissertation here. He says on page 187 that in the Sargon legend text, as far as it is preserved, there is nothing, again, of a lexical, grammatical, or orthographical, the way the characters are written. Nothing of a lexical, grammatical, or orthographical nature that need to be early. Okay? There just aren't. There's nothing in there that makes the argument that the story is early. So you are actually on very defensible ground to say that the Sargon birth legend is late, and for the sake of our discussion, later than the Moses story. You can make a really good argument for that. And again, Lewis lays out how to do it in his dissertation. On page 188, he says that there are 3 idiomatic expressions which occur in the legend of Sargon. This is important, that are attested only at the end of the second millennium, which would be like 1000 BC, or in the Neo-Assyrian period, again, which is this late period where the tablets that we have actually come from. He says this provides the strongest evidence available that the Sargon legend was composed in its present form at a much later date than previously thought. Again, he's not writing this. I hate to be a little silly here, but again, because of the kind of stuff you run into on the internet, I'm going to say it this way. This guy's not writing a dissertation at a Christian school or a seminary just to reflexively defend the Bible on some point that he doesn't like. This is NYU. It's a dissertation. He's an Assyriologist. Okay, let that sink in. He's being honest. He's doing what good scholars should do, regardless of what his own personal predilections are. I mean, this is the data. These are the data, I should say, and this is the conclusion that is very defensible, very late for the story. But you won't hear any of that on the internet. What you're going to be shown on the internet is you're going to be shown the Sargon birth story, and then you're going to be shown the Moses story, and somebody's going to say, see, the Bible stole more material from Mesopotamia. Really? Again, if you run into somebody claiming that, maybe the Ancient Origins website, they love to do stuff like this. You have just found a person, A, with an axe to grind, and B, who isn't a scholar. Okay, it's just that simple. This is why I say primary texts are what you should focus on, the data that actually exist. And peer-reviewed scholarship, where people, they specialize in this stuff. They go through the material. And in the overwhelming number of cases, regardless of if they're a Christian or a Jew or not a Christian or an atheist, whatever, especially in dissertations, they really make an effort, far and away. It's not everybody, but far and away, they make an effort to be honest. And we have a good example here in Lewis's dissertation. Now, there's something else the internet won't tell you, and that is the problems of dissimilarities between the two stories, the Sargon legend and the Moses story in Exodus 2. I'll offer one more little bit from Lewis's dissertation here. He writes on page 384, so this is toward the end. For a long time, scholars had accepted the premise that the birth legends of Sargon and Moses were unusually similar in form and content. However, in recent years, and this is the 60s and 70s, work by M. Kogan, M. Greenberg, and others has challenged this assumption by stressing the different motivations for the abandonment, by asserting a closer parallel between the Moses story and an Egyptian myth concerning Horus. Of course, Redford, essentially debunks that with the late material. But I quote that to say that other scholars besides Lewis, besides Redford, again, have not thought of the Sargon birth story as a really good parallel. Now, Redford doesn't like either. He doesn't like the Horus story. He doesn't like the Sargon story. But some other scholars have looked at the Sargon story and go, there's just too much different about it for it to have been a model. There's just too much different. And again, the textual situation is that it's very late anyway. So it isn't just one guy. It isn't just Redford. I mean, there are other people who have noticed this, and they've tried out the Egyptian story. But like I said, Redford doesn't like that either because the material is just so late. How in the world could this work? So let's go into some of the differences here. There are, here's the short list. There are 5. We'll just give you a short list of 5, and Lewis summarizes these. The Hebrew story, Exodus 2, in relation specifically to the Sargon story, has some significant disconnections. One, the concept of genocide as the motivating factor underlying the need to abandon the child. Okay, that is not in the Sargon story. Certainly in the Exodus story, Moses is exposed to save his life from a threat to all Hebrew male infants. That's just not part of the Sargon story. Number two, the hero, the child, is hidden for 3 months. Okay, that's the Exodus story, until it's no longer possible to conceal him. You don't get that in the Sargon story. The role of the sister in the Exodus story, who watches over the hero, the child, from a distance as the representative of the mother, you don't get that. 4, the use of Pharaoh's daughter to rescue and adopt the infant. Again, you don't have a royal daughter. And 5th, the hiring of the natural mother to nurse the child. Again, here are 5 core elements to the Exodus 2 story that do not appear in the Sargon story. And all you have is the means to float the baby. Well, look, if you lived in the Delta, the Egyptian Delta, and we know that they lived there because you have, the whole Pithom and Ramses thing, Avaris, the land of Goshen, all that stuff, back in Genesis. We know where the Hebrews were at, and it's the Delta region. So there's lots of water there, and there's lots of marshes there. If you were going to hide the child from Pharaoh's men, where would you put him? It's at least a possibility. You would think, well, I can't stash the kid at home because it's not like we have IKEA furniture here where we can put him somewhere and no one will ever find him. Okay, you're limited in your options. If you're going to put him outside, hide him in the marsh, and you can't just throw the kid in. You got to build something. You got to create something that'll float. Again, this is just sort of a normal thing. If you consider this a possibility, you would just do these things, and that's the only real similarity between the Exodus story and the Sargon story. All this other stuff is different and significantly different because these aren't just sort of throwaway elements in the story. These elements are crucial to the story because the story gives us this providential irony. That's a big theme in the Exodus 2 story about how the little baby's sister goes out, to watch and sees, little baby Moses taken out of the water, and she's right on the spot. I mean, it's calculated, it's planned, it's ironic, and speaks to the Egyptian woman. Hey, should we go get a nurse to nurse the child? Sure, great idea. And so the little girl, her sister, runs and goes and gets his mom. Again, these details are important to, again, telling and showing us how God providentially inverted and really subverted what's going on in Egypt. He uses Pharaoh's household from which, the administration, from which the command to kill the male children came, to save the deliverer. And these are very obvious things. They're crucial to the story. They are not throwaway elements, and none of them are in their Sargon story. Now, I'm going to go to Carpenter, his commentary on Exodus. He has a few things to say about this as well. And then we'll transition into our second question, that will be the conclusion of our episode here. But Carpenter writes about, the comparison here. He says, this is not the case of the exposure or rejection of an unwanted infant. And again, that just runs through the stories, these other, abandoned child stories frequently. This is the purposeful and tender dedication of an infant to the sovereignty of God. The writer-editor may have employed the genre form of the Sargon legend, just sort of the, structurally, some of the elements here, but he has emptied it of its mythological overtones and filled it with Israelite history and theology. He has effectively changed its content and structure to fit his purposes, creating a historical narrative even antithetical to the Sargon legend to fit his purposes. It is evident that major essential differences exist between these two ancient narratives. Also, Hofmeier is probably correct to challenge this supposed borrowing from Mesopotamian literature, since the whole section, Exodus 2, verses 1 through 10, is permeated with specifically Egyptian elements. Now, he quotes Hofmeier here, or he footnotes Hofmeier, pages 138 to 140. Hofmeier lists 6 specific expressions, textual expressions, that are Egyptian and not Mesopotamian in origin. If you're just borrowing a Mesopotamian story, why would you do that? If you're writing either in an Egyptian context or the events that you're writing about took place in an Egyptian context, then this makes sense, again, to have these Egyptian elements in it. If you're just doing something, much later, hey, I need a good story, and then I'm gonna sort of steal it and adopt it. You wouldn't You wouldn't think, well, let's just throw, Egyptian words in there, or Egyptian phrases or idioms or something. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So Hofmeyr again says we have to look at the Egyptian elements in here to really make sense of it, because the Sargon story by itself would have been perfectly serviceable if that's what's happening. Now, all of this suggests that the biblical writer, again, if we take all this as a whole, was not dependent on the Horus myth. Certainly, again, Redford points out that material is so late. And it also suggests he was not dependent on the Sargon story either. The keyword there is dependent. In both cases, the Moses story may predate the presumed source, either the Sargon source and certainly the Horus stuff. It's conceivable that the Moses story predates both of those. And if you're looking at it that way, then you have to approach the whole subject a little bit differently. Now, we could ask, well, what if the biblical writer or a later editor knew about the Sargon story? Let's just play what if here. I would say that doesn't rule out the coherence of Exodus 2 being an actual event. In fact, it's a perfect way. It's really a good way to frame the birth of the one who delivered Yahweh's people out of chaos. Because ultimately, Moses is going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and through the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea in English Bibles. Water, again, the chaos symbol. Linking it conceptually in some way to Mesopotamian material is actually a really good idea, especially if it's associated with Babylon. Now, Van der Meerup, who's an author of A History of the Ancient Near East, on page 63 says, the last centuries of the third millennium were characterized by successive periods of centralization of power under two city dynasties, one from Akkad in northern Babylonia in the 24th and 23rd centuries BC, and the other from Ur in the far south of the 21st century, unquote. Now, Akkad is where Sargon the Great ruled. That's where he's from, and that's where he ruled. And so he is associated with Babylon by virtue of the location of this city. It's in North Babylon, North Babylonia. There would have been a telling irony. Think about it this way. There would have been a telling irony and a theological polemic if, and we're just playing what if here, if the writer used the legend of Sargon of Akkad's birth story to tell the story of the rise of Yahweh's deliverer, really his savior figure, for rescuing his people from chaos. Those people, of course, had originated from Abraham himself from Ur. And this works whether Ur is in southern Babylon, southern Babylonia, or northwest Mesopotamia. It's still Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the referent point, again, for a lot of the chaos stuff we see in Genesis 1 through 11. The irony and messaging is the same. Yahweh is greater than his chaos rivals. In other words, the similarity of the birth stories would draw attention to a literate Israelite or Jew to Yahweh's defeat of chaos. In other words, if you link the birth of the deliverer in Exodus 2, if you link that to something Mesopotamian, even though there's all these Egyptian elements, if you link it in some way, if people are reading that, and the story's set in Egypt, but this kind of sounds like that Mesopotamian dude. If that's what's happening in somebody's head, then the writer gets to compare and contrast what Yahweh is doing to save his people out of chaos. And it takes your mind back to when the chaos began and where it began, where it's rooted. Babylon, Mesopotamia. Genesis 1 through 11, I've said it many times in the podcast, is just cluttered with Mesopotamian material for a reason. This is where it's the anti-Eden. There's so much content in Genesis 1 through 11 that responds to, that inverts, that subverts Mesopotamian stuff, okay, and tells the story, of just Deuteronomy 32 worldview, Babel, just that one, just Genesis 11, that's the big one. But you got Genesis 6 with the Abkalu, you got stuff in Genesis 1 through 3 that takes us back to Mesopotamia. Genesis 1 through 11 is designed to pit God's desire for Eden against the anti-Eden, the forces of chaos, all of the forces that disrupt what God wants on earth. And the metaphor for doing that is consistently Babylon, Babylonia, this part of the world. And Sargon the Great comes from that part of the world. That's where he lived. That's where he ruled. And so if you intentionally do enough of a comparative work in the way you tell the story of Moses' birth to make people think of that place instead of just Egypt, you have accomplished something significant. You have made the reader see that Yahweh is at work subverting and defeating the forces of chaos that are very, very ancient, more ancient than Egypt. So again, this is just a little thought experience, just a what if. Again, there's no way literarily to prove this, any sort of dependence or cross-fertilization, because the material as we have it is late. But just what if? I mean, to me, it's just fascinating that a writer could be so clever. And by the way, none of that rules out the historicity of the event. It's just literary strategy for theologizing the event. The event, of course, being Moses' birth. Theologizing an event and the event are not, the historicity of the event are not mutually exclusive. They're not. Remember the story of how I got my job at Logos? All those events happened. Now, again, the way I tell the story is I'm making God a character. I'm making God a behind-the-scenes actor in the events that unfold. And I'm not telling you that under inspiration, okay? I have no divine guidance to tell you that. That was just my perception. But my perception, my theologizing of what happened, my making it a mythic narrative, doesn't mean that the events didn't happen. They did. It's just the retelling of the story to make a theological point, to make my listeners think theologically important thoughts. And this is precisely what I'm suggesting, that if the writer of Exodus or an editor or whatever had knowledge of the Sargon story, it would be really clever to use some of that in how the story is told, even in a deeply Egyptian context, because your literate reader, their mind is going to go back to where chaos began, to why we have the people of God selecting Abram out of the region we know as Babylonia. Whether it was the north or the south, doesn't matter. God selects a person out after he has divorced the nations, severed the relationship between him and them. He plucks this guy out of his polytheistic context. We learned he was raised in a polytheistic context in Babylonia, okay, from Genesis 11. He plucks this guy out. He makes a covenant with him and his wife to raise up a new family, a new human family. He's not giving up on the original Edenic plan. He's going to use this guy and his offspring through this woman who can't have children. So she's perfect. Again, it's a supernatural event. He's going to use her and him to create a human family. And through them, he makes a covenant that will draw all of these other nations back home. In other words, it will cure chaos. Again, this is really, really clever. But we're just playing what if here. But it does not rule out the historicity. It's a literary strategy. And there are other examples of this. It's not a coincidence that Egypt in other parts of the Old Testament is actually identified with Babylon in other ways. Egypt is actually identified with Babylon in the Old Testament as a chaos agent. For example, Pharaoh is cast as Leviathan in Ezekiel 29, verse 3, and Ezekiel 32, 2. It's Ezekiel. He's writing from a Babylonian context. He's talking about Pharaoh of Egypt, but he's using Leviathan again, the wonderful, wonderfully elastic, chaos symbol. The Babylonian context, again, is very evident. It seems reasonable that given the non-bizarre circumstances of the Moses story and the proximity of the Hebrews living in the Delta to marshy areas, that we have a real story of a real event, a desperate mother who risked the life of her child on a gamble, that he'd be discovered by someone, a woman of importance. I call it a gamble, but it's a faith-based gamble. She's trusting God. There's nothing uncomely about his birth. He's not undesirable. He's not like some divine hybrid. It just seems a reasonable act of desperation by a woman. It's reasonable, at least in its details. She doesn't just set the kid afloat anywhere, toss him in. She has to build a little craft. What would you do? You do the same thing. Egyptians have Hebrew servants, so it's not unusual that the little slave girl would be allowed, to show up and have a conversation. We talked about that, when we talked about the Israelite bondage. Again, all the elements are there. There's no evidence as well that the infant Moses was circumcised. And so the child would have blended into an Egyptian context. We don't read Moses ever got circumcised. Later, we're going to hit some of that where we discuss that. But here, no. It seems reasonable that a really good strategy for linking Babylon and Egypt as chaos agents who will be defeated by Yahweh, raising up a human deliverer, it'd be really reasonable to play off the Sargon story and blend in the Egyptian material of the actual historical context. You kill two birds with one stone. And again, you're not fabricating events, you're theologizing. It's extraordinarily clever, is really how I look at this. It's really, really clever. Now, the last item, again, we'll transition here. There's just one thing I want to say real briefly about Moses' name, and I'll put Lewis's dissertation in the protected folder, in case people are interested in this, and I'll put this article as well in the protected folder. Even though this one's going to be dense, you'd more or less have to have some Hebrew or Semitic or some language study to really kind of get this. But in regard to Moses' name, there's an article that's a really good one by J. Gwyn, that's Gwyn Griffiths. It's titled The Egyptian Derivation of the Name Moses. It's Journal of Near Eastern Studies, Volume 12, Number 4, October 1953. It's about 8 pages long, but it's a very thorough treatment of how scholars have tried to link Moshe in Hebrew, that's Mem, Shin, and then He, with something in Egyptian, and do it coherently, because there are things that don't align in the possibilities. Moses, again, we get this little comment at the end. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. Well, again, it requires a little bit of thought. And in this article, Griffiths goes through all the options, and essentially, I'm just cutting to the chase here because it's full of Egyptian and transliteration, it's full of Hebrew and all this other stuff. She argues really well. And she's just drawing on other research and then answering a few questions that are kind of outliers, that what we have here is Moses is mes, that's MS, in Egyptian. And it's not a verb to draw out. She believes, and again, she has really good reason for arguing this, and she has really good examples, that that term just means child. So when we go back to Exodus 2, verse 10, what we see happening is the woman, the Pharaoh's daughter, takes the child out of water, and she says, I'll just read it. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. She became his son. And she named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. So the Egyptian is saying, I'm going to call him Mes, which means child in Egypt. I'm going to call the child. And Mes in Egyptian was actually used as a proper name. Again, Griffith's article gives really good examples of this. It's not unusual. It's not odd. It's not unknown. It was also a proper name that would get appended to a deity name like Ra-Mes, what we would think of as Ramses. Okay, Ra-Mes would be like son of Ra or something like that, or Ra is born. Griffiths points out these names were usually commemorating the birthday of a deity, that kind of thing. But in this case, if there was an original Egyptian theophoric element, a deity name that Pharaoh's daughter stuck onto this, the biblical writer takes it off, and we're just left with, Moshe. Mes in Egyptian just means child. So she names the child. She calls him child. Moses, will just say, because I drew him out of the water. Now, a lot of your commentaries will try to link an Egyptian term for drawing out with the name Moses. I think that's a mistake. I think the point is that Pharaoh's daughter calls him child, and when she says, because I drew him from the water, it means because I saved him and kept him. In other words, the drawing out of the child is not an etymological clue to the Egyptian term behind the name Moses. It refers to the event. I'm going to call this child Moses, because I saved him. He's mine. Again, it's a much neater solution. Again, there are places you can go to read about the other ones. Griffith's article, Hoffmeyer's book, pages 140 to 142 goes through this. I think Hoffmeyer tries to be diplomatic to Kenneth Kitchen, and he had a real affection for Kitchen, as did a lot of other people. And having met him once, I can see why. But Kitchen wants to have the woman who says, I drew him up out of the water to be Moses' real mom, but Moses' real mom didn't draw him out of the water. It was Pharaoh's daughter. So I think we can lay that option aside, even though, again, Hofmeier tries to be nice about that in what he writes, but he's well aware of Griffith's article, interacts with it, and I think that's the simplest, neatest solution. Mess, MS, is a very normal Egyptian term. If you're really into philology and Semitic linguistic stuff, get Griffith's article for what happened to the H in Moshe and how the S in Mess and the Sh in Moshe align. There's linguistic coherence to that. If you want to read that stuff, you can. But I wanted to just append a little bit on this because, people are curious, does this work in Egyptian language? It does. It does, and it makes sense in context. So that was a lot to digest. Again, most of our episode this time, focused on the abandoned child motif, but it's really important because people are going to use the story here. Like I said, what you're going to get on the internet is they're going to, say, oh, let's go read Exodus 2. Got that down? You got it in your head now? Well, look at the Sargon birth story. And then they're going to say, the writer, of Exodus 2, biblical writers stealing material. It's so utterly simplistic and really fundamentally uninformed that you should know about it. And so I wanted to make that the centerpiece of this episode. Yeah, we'll get through chapter 2. So we're in Exodus 2, 11 through 25. That is the remainder of chapter 2 today. And a couple of things, again, to park on in the course of this episode. But let's just start by reading the chapter just so it's in the heads of those listening. This is when Moses flees to Midian. That's the episode, the series of events in which we are following. So one day, verse 11, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? He answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father, Reuel, he said, how is it that you have come home so soon today? They said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock. He said to his daughters, then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. During those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So that is the remainder of Exodus chapter 2. And again, as is our pattern, just some things of interest in the passage. I'm not going to sort of rehearse the passage back to you. Most of it is pretty self-evident as to what happens, but there are some things as usual, going on under the surface, and then there's a few stopping points that really deserve some attention. And the first one of these is in verse 15, and that is when Moses flees Pharaoh and stays in the land of Midian. So what in the world is the land of Midian is the obvious question. And it's actually a more important question than we might realize because it's going to take us into other areas as we proceed through the book of Exodus, a few other really important topics. And now, again, it just doesn't seem like it's much more than trivial, but trust me, I think you'll see why it's not in a moment. I'm going to start here with Sarna in his Exodus commentary. He has a few things to say about this. He says, Moses is now an outcast fleeing for his life. the land of Midian, where he takes refuge, refers to an area under the control of one or more of the 5 semi-nomadic tribes that, according to biblical sources, make up the Midianite Confederation. And he cites a few passages here. Numbers 31:8 says, they killed the kings of Midian. So notice the plural there, the kings of Midian. So it's more than one person. With the rest of their slain, Evi, Rechem, Tzor, Hor, and Rivah, the 5 kings of Midian. And they also killed Balaam, the son of Beor, with the sword. So Numbers 31:8 alludes to, again, this idea of a confederation of kings, of rulers, that are, all sort of operating under the rubric, of Midian. So Midian is going to be a place where there's, again, more than one domain, more than one ruler. It's going to be this tribal confederation kind of thing. Joshua 13:21 says, or refers to all the cities of the tableland and all the kingdom of Sihon or Sion, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, whom Moses defeated with the leaders of Midian. Again, leaders, plural. Evi and Rechem and Sor and Hur and the Rivah, the princes of Sihon who lived in the land. Again, this is interesting because here we have the Midianite kings, Midianite rulers is probably a better way to say this. In the time of Joshua, under the authority or some sort of lordship, confederation that Sihon of Og, had control over. Of course, he's one of the Amorite kings. That gets us into the Rephaim with the giant clan material. Here they're referred to as princes of Sihon, who lived in the land. So, this is the time of Joshua. I mean, this is going to be some years removed, obviously, from when Moses, wanders into the land of Midian. But again, for our purposes here, it's like, okay, this is some definable or maybe a little bit fuzzy region of land. It has 5 rulers in it. Again, it's this confederation idea. And it is interesting, again, that, Moses winds up here, and later this region is going to become, infamous because of its association in some way with Sihon of Og. Again, this king of the Amorites. Now, if you remember in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, this is the area of Bashan. Well, Midian is considerably south of that. So how to reconcile these two things? Again, it's a little bit far afield for what we're doing right now. It could be that Sihon, again, had sort of an extended, oversight or had control over, maybe by tribute, maybe a vassal arrangement with Midian, that these princes of Midian were somehow under his authority. This isn't necessarily giant clan territory in Midian, but it has some relationship to what's going on there, again, as that we're going to read about much later. So that is a point of interest. Sarna goes on and says, the Midianites ranged over a wide area of the Near East, stretching from the eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba. So if think of a map, think of the Red Sea. It has those 2 prongs. The left prong, sort of points toward the delta region of Egypt. The right prong, that's the Gulf of Aqaba. And to the east of that, on the other side of that watery prong, is what is now, Saudi Arabia. It's that prong, sort of delimits in modern terms the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You've got Jordan as well, also referred to as the Arabian Peninsula. That idea. So Sarna is saying Midian as a land stretches from the eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, so that right-hand prong eastward, up through the Syro-Arabian desert, which again is going to be the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia today, Jordan, and into the borders of the land of Israel, west and northwest of Eilat. Eilat is right sort of at the tip of that right prong. If you're looking at a map, again, that right prong of the Red Sea. So north and northwest obviously would take us into the land of Israel, probably not as far as Bashan, but maybe the lower region of Bashan. I mean, who knows precisely how this would have been defined. It's just, again, general territory. So we can't, take this as evidence, again, that Moses has fled into giant clan territory. I mean, it's possible, but it's more likely that there was some sort of overlordship relationship between the king of the Amorites, Sihon and Og, and the Midianite confederation, that the latter was somehow subservient or answerable to the former. So let me just throw in one other thing, because we're going to get into, you probably already have sort of picked up on it. This is going to directly relate to the location of Mount Sinai, the location of the burning bush incident, which we'll actually get into more next week when we hit Exodus 3, because that's the passage for it. But we'll say a few things about it in this episode. But I want to add what Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary says here about Midian. I'll just read you the selection here. The origin of the name Midian is unknown, though it has been suggested that the root Madi is non-Semitic and possibly cognate to the designation of Medes of much later times. The biblical genealogy, and the writer references Genesis 25:2. The biblical genealogy includes two variants, Midian and Midan, cognates of both of which appear in Greek sources of the Hellenistic period as names of towns east of the Gulf of Aqaba. So there's that location again, east of the Gulf of Aqaba, over in what we would now think Saudi Arabia, and then a little bit north of that, Jordan. Biblical tradition listed the eponymous ancestor Midian as one of 6 sons born to the patriarch Abraham by his second wife, Keturah. That's Genesis 25:1-6. So again, that's what the writer was referring to by the biblical genealogy of the name Midian. It shows up in Genesis 25:1-6, specifically verse 2, as one of the 6 sons born to Abraham by Keturah. Back to the quotation. According to this account, Abraham sent these sons away from Canaan to the east country, a tradition that implies an origin in Canaan proper for these Proto-Arabic tribal designations. This tradition is now powerfully reinforced by linguistic evidence that derives the pre-Islamic Arabic language and writing system from the Bronze Age Mediterranean coastal region. So there's a connection linguistically between Arabic before the advent of Islam, and that language and languages that again are closer to the Mediterranean coast, which of course would be Canaan proper. So the linguistic evidence backs up this notion of Genesis 25:1-6 as far as having a Canaan or Canaanite origin for the people of Midian, and again through in biblical terms through Abraham and Keturah. Now, continuing on with Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, it takes what I guess is fair to say a liberal bent when it comes to some of this material. I'll just read it to you. The Midianites as a historically existent society are represented in the Joseph stories, Genesis 37:25-36, as traders traveling by camel caravan. The Midianites as a historically existent society are represented, again, in this passage as this caravan traveling between Gilead, which is the north part of the Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan, and Egypt. And in this case, dealing in slaves as well as gum, balm, and myrrh. The term Midianite alternates with the term Ishmaelite in that passage. Probably to be explained, here's the liberal bent, at least a little bit, probably to be explained by the fact that at the time the narrative reached its present form, the Midianites had ceased to exist as a distinct social group, but were identified with an ethnic group later called Ishmaelites. The narrative certainly is not earlier than the monarchy, time of Saul, David, and Solomon, and there's no reason to believe it is based upon any historical event. Now that's from Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. It's by Mendenhall again, and he's sort of playing his hand as far as his view of the historicity of the text. That's why I said a liberal bent. Now Sarna, back in his, this is actually a different commentary. He has a Jewish Publication Society commentary on Exodus, which we've quoted from before, and we did a few minutes ago. And he also has the Genesis volume. Now here's what he says in the Genesis volume. He's a little more charitable than Mendenhall is in the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. So in talking about the discrepancy between Midianites interchanged with Ishmaelites, because again, if the Midianites came from Abraham through Keturah, back in Genesis 25, then how can we possibly call them Ishmaelites? Because Ishmael is born by Hagar. So we have a disconnection here, a problem. And Mendenhall's solution is that, well, this is not historical anyway, and it's probably because the Midianites ceased to be a people by the time this was written, and they just got conflated by mistake, so on and so forth. Sarn is a little more generous. He writes this: the discrepancy in names has been variously explained by traditional commentators. Genesis Rabbah, 8420, and this is rabbinic stuff, so that's what he means by traditional commentators. Genesis Rabbah, 8420, followed by Rashi, postulates that Joseph was traded several times. Ibn Ezra identifies the Ishmaelites with Midianites on the basis of Judges 8:24, and I'll read that. Gideon said to him, "Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil," for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Remember, Gideon was connected with the Midianites, okay? So I'll repeat that. Ibn Ezra identifies the Ishmaelites with Midianites on the basis of Judges 8:24, which relates that Midianites possessed golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. This passage suggests that the term Ishmaelite was used as an epithet for nomadic traders rather than in an ethnic sense. Midianite, on the other hand, indicates a specific ethnic affiliation. Even if the two names are indicative of originally distinct narrative strands that have here been interwoven, it must have been the close connection between Ishmael and Midian in biblical tradition, both being offspring of Abraham, again by different women, that led to their fusion. That's the end of the Sarna quote. So again, he doesn't see this as any indication of it not being historical. So again, he's more charitable than Mendenhall was in Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. The point here is that Moses is a distant relative of the Midianites before he gets married to Zipporah. Okay, before he meets, Jethro or Ruel. We'll talk about those names in a moment. Moses is already something of a distant relative because Moses is from the line of Isaac and Jacob back to Abraham. He's an Israelite. So there's some connection already. There's some family connection. Back to verse 15, Moses goes to Midian. As I mentioned before, this is going to take us into the burning bush encounter, this location of Sinai, all this kind of stuff. So I'll just sort of telegraph this a little bit, deal with it a little bit, because we're going to actually return, to this topic in other places, in the book of Exodus in the series. So in Exodus 3:1, let's just look at Exodus 3:1, because right after our portion for today, Exodus 2:11 through 25, Moses is in Midian. He flees to Midian. He gets married. He's got Jethro, your Ruel, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Then the very next verse, Exodus 3:1, says, "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." So Exodus 3:1 is typically read as though Moses is tending Jethro's flocks in Midian. And so the assumption is that the mountain of God in Exodus 3:1, which is named there as Horeb, seems to be in Midian. Now you could read the verse that way, and some do, but the verse could also be read in a different way. Okay, think about it. I'm going to read it again. "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." The verse could very obviously be read that Moses left Midian and journeyed to the west of Midian, or a wilderness west of Midian. In other words, Exodus 3:1 doesn't actually tell us with certainty that the mountain of God, Horeb, is in Midian. You can't really use that verse for it. Because if you read the verse, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. Now, Jethro certainly is the priest of Midian. Okay, we got that. But he led Jethro's flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb. So Horeb could very well be perceived and actually be to the west of Midian, somewhere where it wasn't in Midian proper. Of course, the difficulty here is, well, how do we define Midian with any precision? Because it could be this territory of east of the Gulf of Aqaba, all the way up north, to where you hit Eilat, and even beyond that into Canaan territory. How do we know this specifically? Now, I mentioned this. You can't read that. I think this is just my opinion. mean, I used to be on this bandwagon that Mount Sinai or Horeb, and again, we have to deal with that as well. What's with the two names? I used to be on the bandwagon that Mount Sinai was in Midian, specifically, Jebel al-Lawz. I'm not anymore. I think it's possible, but it has there are serious uncertainties with it and problems with it. And frankly, the evidence used popularly to support the idea it ranges from anything from something contrived to just being weak and iffy. It's just far from secure. Let's put it that way. There are some significant problems with it. I think we can leave the door open to it, but certainly you can't take this Midian language and go take a flock and go all the way west of the Gulf of Aqaba, all the way down to the traditional Sinai. This is hundreds and hundreds of miles, through arid desert country to hit the traditional site of Sinai. I don't see how Exodus 3:1 can really be reconciled with the traditional site. But what people fail to realize is there are actually more than two candidates for Sinai. It's not just a choice between the traditional Mount Sinai at Jebel Musa and Jebel al-Lawz in Midian or Saudi Arabia. There are other possible locations. They just don't get the press. And there are certain passages of Scripture that would frankly rule out both the traditional site and a location in Midian, but would actually work well if you're talking about territory that's just to the north or northwest of the Gulf of Aqaba, the tip there, Eilat. There are other candidates here. So again, that's kind of as far as I really want to get into that specific subject. We'll hit it again as we're going through Exodus, but I'm just putting those cards on the table that I used to think a lot more highly of the Mount Sinai in Arabia idea than I do now. It does have serious weaknesses, but the traditional view also has some pretty serious weaknesses too. But there are other possibilities. Before we leave that, I mentioned about the names Horeb and Sinai. Now, what I just read in Exodus 3:1, it takes us into other questions. What's the relationship of Midian to Horeb? Because is Horeb in Midian or is it to the west of Midian? As you read the verse, you can read it that way. And then also, what's the relationship of Horeb to Sinai? Here's I think a significant passage. I'm just going to read you this, and without getting into it, because it's in Exodus 17. We'll hit it at some point, in the course of the podcast. But Exodus 17, 1-7 says this: all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and they camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go, and behold, I will," now catch this line, this is Exodus 17:6, "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" So this event occurs at Horeb. And if you keep reading Exodus 17, they're only going to get to Sinai just right around Exodus 20. In Exodus 19, they have a ways to go before they get to the place where they get the law. So here we have a disconnection. It's a clear disconnection between the mountain, or Horeb, just the term Horeb, and the mountain of God that they're going to end up at. So that's another issue for when we're trying to determine, or at least come up with an idea of where Mount Sinai is. Exodus 3:1 links the two, and it's not the only passage that links Horeb and Sinai. And then you have other passages like this one that clearly distinguish them as separate locations. Now, Sarna comments on this. He says, many texts seem to identify this location. He's commenting on Exodus 3:1, Horeb. Many texts seem to identify this location with Sinai, but there are also indications that they may not be identical. Thus, while Mount Sinai appears frequently, Mount Horeb is rare. And there's no reference to the wilderness of Horeb as there is to that of Sinai. Further, an impression of some distance between the two is gained from the story of the water crisis at Rephidim, as told in Exodus 17:1-7. There, the divine spirit is said to have been manifest before Moses, close by a rock at Horeb. Yet Rephidim was the last station of the Israelites before entering the wilderness of Sinai. We may be dealing with different strands or different tradition. Or Horeb may have been the name of a wider region in which Mount Sinai, a specific peak, was located. Perhaps that peak eventually lent its name to the entire area. Horeb means desolate or dry, and its location has not been identified. So again, we're going to hit all this again when we get into Exodus 3. But you should know, even at this point, that we've got some problems here between Midian. What is it? How wide is it? Where does it go? Where does it stop? That kind of thing. Or does it have borders? Sinai, Horeb. Again, all these place names. There is variability, and there just isn't agreement. So we have to think about, well, what do the terms mean in which context and why, and all that sort of stuff. The location of Sinai, again, is not a simple thing. So if someone tells you it is a simple thing, that all you got to do is look at this or do that, it just isn't. It just isn't. There's just more to it than that a close reading of Scripture is going to take you into some of these problem areas. And if you don't deal with them, you're really not dealing with the subject, very well anyway. So let's move on. In verse 16, we want to keep going here in Exodus chapter 2. In verse 16, we read, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters." Then in verse 18, we read, "When those daughters came home to their father Reuel." And then in verse 21, we read about the priest of Midian named Reuel becomes Moses' father-in-law. But in Exodus 3:1, which we just read, it is Jethro who is Moses' father-in-law, and he is explicitly called the priest of Midian. So what's going on here? I mean, who is Moses' father-in-law? Is it Reuel? Is it Jethro? Who's the priest of Midian? Is it one of these two guys? Why the different names? It's actually going to get worse because you're going to have a third name thrown in certain passages. This is a well-known historical problem, historical textual problem in the book and elsewhere. So I'm going to read from P.E. Hughes's article in the Dictionary of the Old Testament of the Pentateuch, just to give you some flavor for it, again, for how some scholars at least, approach it. He writes, "The priest of Midian of Exodus 2:16 is called Reuel in Exodus 2:18, but referred to as Jethro in a number of places. Exodus 18:1, we could put in Exodus 3:1, 18:1, 2, 5, 6, 9, 10, and 12. In addition, Judges 4:11, in that passage, mention is made of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses." You got 3. I'll just read you that verse. This is Judges 4:11. "Now Heber, the Kenite, had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak of Zaananim, which is near Kadesh." So, okay, now we got 3. Now, what are we supposed to do? Back to Hughes. Hughes says, cumulatively, not only is Moses' father-in-law given the 3 names of Reuel, Jethro, and Hobab, but the latter does not align with Numbers 10:29, which describes Hobab as the son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. It's just starting to sound like I'm my own grandpa now, the old, folk song. Back to Hughes. Different proposals have been presented to solve this dilemma, from source critical solutions, like Jethro is is the guy for the E document, the E, right, the JEDB thing. Jethro is in the E source, Moses' father-in-law, and Ruel and Hobab belong to the J document. And this is why they're mixed, because the Pentateuch is just a mixture of these different documents. The editor just goofed here or whatever. Again, that's sort of a standard source critical approach. So Hughes says, one of the approaches is to try to refer to source critical solutions. We also have, back to Hughes, we also have the suggestion that a misreading of the Numbers passage may have influenced the identification of Jethro as Hobab in Judges. So again, then we'd have an error in Judges. To the proposition that we may be missing fine distinctions between personal and clan names, that's the third option. Some have proposed that we're just missing some fine distinctions between personal names and clan names. This latter perspective was advanced by W.F. Albright, who concluded that Ruel was a clan name and Jethro was his proper name, with the seeming reference to the same person in Numbers 10, 29 through 32, attributed to him by a misvocalization in the Hebrew text. So Albright's solution is, look, one of these is a clan name, the other one is a personal name, a proper name, and Numbers 10, 29 through 32 confuses things because the Hebrew text, some scribe at some point put the wrong vowels to the consonants. Remember, the consonants are the things that were, the original part of the composition, and vowels were added much later. So Albright notes that if you look at the Hebrew there, you can read the Hebrew term as Kotain, son-in-law of Moses, as opposed to father-in-law, which would get a different pronunciation. So this was Albright's solution. Sarna, we'll bring him into the picture, in his Exodus commentary, writes this. Ruel is mentioned once again in Numbers 10:29, where he quotes, Hobab, son of Ruel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. And again, Albright's saying it could be son-in-law, depending on what vowels you give it. Sarna says, Ruel is mentioned once again in Numbers 10:29, where it's uncertain which of the two is so designated. So Sarna points out that if you actually read Numbers 10:29, Hobab, son of Ruel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, you can't actually tell which one is Moses' father-in-law. It could be Hobab, it could be Ruel. I mean, it just depends on syntactically how you take that. It's the relationship of the word order here with the semantics. So he says it's uncertain which of the two is so designated. Sarna continues, from Judges 4:11, it would appear that Hobab is the father-in-law, but in other texts, this latter epithet is given to Jethro. So Hobab and Jethro, two different names, who also bears the title priest of Midian. Sarna notes, rabbinic exegesis reconciles the discrepancies by assuming that Ruel was the grandfather of the girls, and that the other names all refer to the same person who bore several names. Many modern scholars prefer to assign the variants to different strands of tradition. However, it is to be noted that the title priest of Midian is only explicitly attached to Jethro. This raises the possibility that Hebrew Yitro, or Yeter, is not a proper name, but an honorific name, meaning something like His Excellency. And as a biblical parallel, he points to Genesis 49:3. Here, I'm going to read you that verse. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. The word preeminent there, occurring twice in the same verse, is the word yeter in Hebrew. It's the same that you'll find in passages for Jethro. And so Sarna is suggesting that Jethro really isn't a proper name. We should probably understand it as something of an honorific title, like His Excellency. And he further bolsters that by appealing to Akkadian. He says, in Akkadian, Atru, think about it, Yitro, Hebrew, Atru, Akkadian, they sound very much alike. Akkadian is East Semitic, Hebrew is Northwest Semitic. In Akkadian, Atru or Watru means preeminent or foremost, which would be basically the same as what we just read in Genesis 49, verse 3. In addition, several old Akkadian names begin with that element. They begin with Atru, again, which to Sarna suggests we have an honorific title here, like Sir or His Excellency. I hate to use George. Well, George Washington is a good illustration. I mean, that's how George Washington was referred to, His Excellency George Washington. or His Excellency, President George Washington, something like that. It was a title that Washington actually, later on, when they were talking about what to call the leader of the nation, he didn't want to be called His Excellency because it sounded too much like kingship. So president, was what they decided on. But this is the way Washington was referred to routinely. So it could be a similar idea. Lastly, Sarna points out in Ugaritic, several personal nouns are known that are prefixed by the element YTR, exactly the same as Hebrew, yater or yitro. So that's the end of Sarna's contribution there. So it's very possible that the way to reconcile this information is just as we tried to summarize there, that you might have a confusion between son-in-law and father-in-law in the one passage, just depends on what vowels you apply to the Hebrew consonants. You could have Jethro as a title akin to His Excellency. And again, these things, these elements remove the obstacles, remove the contradictions. You're not forced to say, well, these passages are what they are because they're hopelessly contradictory because some editor goofed up when he was making the Pentateuch from these 3 different documents or 2 different documents, J and E. You don't have to go there. For some, that's just an easy solution because, again, they're committed intellectually, to the JEDP idea. And again, I'm not an opponent of editing. I don't buy JEDP because I do think it's based on circular reasoning, as I've said many times on the podcast. But editing certainly, happens throughout Scripture, including the Torah. But we don't need to appeal to that sort of thing when we, actually have a fairly, not only reasonable, but fairly easy solution here. Repointing Hebrew, because again, the vowels were not original. And then looking at other occurrences of this Hebrew lemma, yater, and seeing not only in Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible, but also in Akkadian and Ugaritic, that it refers to some sort of preeminence idea for a person. So the idea that it's an honorific title, that could make pretty good sense. Other items here. Let's talk about the name Ruel. Some of you, again, have already tracked on this as hearing that term, you're going to be on this point already. The name means friend of God. El is the generic term for God. The other part is the word for friend or companion. Friend of God, or maybe friend of El. Although Nauf in Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary writes this. He says the name means friend of God or God is friend. El in personal names does not necessarily refer to the god El. And he's right. He's right about that. So just because it's El doesn't mean it's a proper name. That's completely fair. And again, Nauf isn't a card-carrying evangelical by any means. For those of you listening, think that presume that these sorts of discussions sort of default to some sort of evangelical censoring, then you're wrong. Listen to more of the podcast and you'll see how wrong that is. Again, we're just going with good scholarship here. It could mean either, but it doesn't have to mean El. There's nothing wrong with it specifically because of some of the things we're going to get into here, about going back to the Midianites and their ancestry and all that stuff. So it could be El, but that doesn't mean El was perceived as a different deity than the one that Moses is going to encounter, again, at the burning bush and later. So Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary says this, and again, this is Nauf's article on that particular entry, Ruel. He says, Ruel is a son of Esau. Again, in at least one Ruel, this is where the name shows up. Can be used of a son of Esau, Genesis 36:4, verse 10, 13, 17, 1 Chronicles 1:35 and 37. If the list of Genesis 36:10 through 14 reflects the structure of the Edomite tribal system in the 7th century BC, then Ruel was one of the 3 major Edomite tribes and had 4 sub-tribes, again, Genesis 36:10 through 14. And again, that would be no surprise because Esau is identified with Edom in Genesis 36 and elsewhere. Nauf continues, in Numbers 10:29, Ruel is the father of Hobab, the eponymous ancestor of a Kenite clan that settled in the Negev among the tribe of Judah. This clan may well have belonged to the Edomite tribe Ruel before it migrated to the other side of Wadi Arabah. Therefore, Ruel, as Moses' relative, is possibly identical with the Edomite tribe. And he references Albright here, who sort of went along the same trajectory. Now, the point of all that is that it's possible. It's quite possible that Moses, therefore, represents both lines, from Isaac. Both of Isaac's lines, Jacob's line, because Moses is from Levi. And again, if you have this connection here with Esau, Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Moses is sort of emblematic. It has some sort of blood connection with both sides, as well as being a distant relative of the Midianites who overlap with the Ishmaelites. And again, there you have Abraham's seed outside the line of Isaac, which is really kind of interesting. I mean, the person Moses could represent all of the two lines within the one Abrahamic line, and then the line in another Abrahamic line. It's just kind of interesting genealogically. Now, Carpenter writes, that given the lineages involved, it seems, Carpenter says, it seems likely that the Midianites would have known of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but not by the name Yahweh as revealed to Moses in the 3rd chapter of Exodus. I mean, Exodus 3, God is going to reveal this name to Moses. In other words, it's quite coherent. This is me now, this isn't Carpenter. It's quite coherent to think that these people, the Midianites, knew of and worshipped the God of their patriarchal forefathers. Yeah, that's perfectly compatible with what we're reading and what we know of them genealogically. It would be reasonable, because you have again all these lineages going back to Abraham and Isaac. Again, Isaac having the two lines, Jacob and Esau. That these people would have known about the God of their forefathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they knew that God by the name Yahweh. Because if we take Exodus 3 seriously, and Exodus 6:3 is another allusion to this, then God's revealing something to Moses at the burning bush. I am that I am. I am who I am. Okay, and we'll talk about the meaning of the name when we get to Exodus 3 in the podcast. But if that's, if they already knew that, it wouldn't be a revelation to Moses. Well, it was a revelation. And he's identifying in Exodus 3, the same passage, with the people in Egypt and their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I mean, it's the same deity. Now, people who are listening to this are going to think, well, that's just kind of weird, because in my English Bible, I read the name Yahweh in passages before Exodus 3, and some passages that have to do with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I read, the Lord. It's Yahweh there. That's correct. You do. And here's where, again, this is actually where the source critical approach to the Torah really started. Because you have revelations of the divine name in Exodus 3, and then when you have the same divine name supposedly revealed in Exodus 3 to Moses at the burning bush, you have it show up elsewhere in the Old Testament with earlier patriarchs. Some people looked at that and thought, well, that just doesn't make sense. The Pentateuch must be, therefore, a combination of different documents where you had one person writing about God using the name Yahweh, another person writing about God using El or El derivatives like El Shaddai, something like that. And that somebody came along, again, in Israelite or Jewish tradition, and he wove these two things together into one cohesive narrative, and he mixed the names. Again, this is the core of the Mosaic authorship issue. J and E documents. D is something else. P is something else. Okay, but this is where it actually begins because of issues like this. So we've run right into it. Now, again, you don't have to embrace the entirety of the JEDP idea to accept this. Again, I'm what used to be called a supplementarian. I believe there was a Mosaic core. I believe we have material composed or heavily edited in Babylon, Genesis 1 through 11. I believe we have other material derived that gets codified, put in writing from oral tradition of the people, ancient people of Israel themselves. They knew these stories about their ancestors, and eventually those stories got written down. And yes, you do. I think you do have editorial evidence where you have it at some places. An editor must have used the divine name Yahweh in earlier scenes, earlier episodes, specifically so that his readers would understand that we're not dealing with two deities here, specifically. In other words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would have known God by El and El names. Good. They're worshiping one God. Okay, the God, singular, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when you get to Moses, Moses, encounters this same God who reveals to him another name, and he's going to relate to Moses by a different name. Well, the patriarchs didn't know that, but it doesn't matter because they're the same deity. But whoever is reading the Hebrew Bible centuries later sees and understands that both he and his own readers, as he's they're putting the final touches on this thing that we're going to call the Torah, and wider than that, the Tanakh, sees the need to make sure his readers understand that these names all lead to the same place, all lead to the same deity. And so an editor would insert the subsequent name, the covenant name, the Yahweh. He will put that into passages so that his readers understand that it's the same God. It's the same entity, the same deity, the same person. This is the way you would do it. You tie those threads together. Now, you can do that without having the Pentateuch be, in terms of its origin, be completely, created out of 4 different documents. Again, my view, and again, it's a minority view now. It used to be a majority view back in the day, is that you have a substantial element of oral tradition from the Israelites, the Hebrews. You have Moses writing material, and then that stuff gets edited later, gets accrued to, and it gets edited later. See, JEDP, what JEDP really wanted to deny was any sense of Mosaic authorship. That's really what it was after. That's what was in the crosshairs. And once you do that, you don't have a need for Moses. And they were questioning even the existence of Moses, and so on and so forth. So that's really what that was about. It wasn't about trying necessarily to come up with a better way to understand why we have the Torah and let Moses be a contributor. See, that's the supplementarian position that I hold. I don't see any reason why Moses could not have been a substantial contributor to what we call the Torah. But if you're a JEDP guy, you don't say that at all. Even evangelicals who buy into JEDP, again, Moses didn't have anything to do with this as far as composition. He's the subject of a lot of it, but as far as composition, he had nothing to do with it. And they'll still affirm the historicity of Moses, but he didn't touch the thing. I think that's too extreme. And ultimately, the way JEDP is articulated and defended, it does fall prey to circular reasoning at points. Again, I've talked about this before and blogged about it, so I don't want to keep going down this road. But this is a really good example where you've got this situation. You just run into it in the text. So again, there's nothing, back up to the major point for our purposes. It's completely coherent that the Midianites, if they're Edomites or Ishmaelites or whateverites, okay, that this people group that Moses finds himself in their midst, it's completely coherent that this group would have worshipped the God that Moses worshipped while he was living in Egypt, and his people, the God of their ancestors, because that same God is he's their God too. All these other ancestors, these other people groups, we know that by virtue of the genealogical comments that I've read here, in the course of discussing the topic here. It's not unreasonable to say, to have this picture. So Moses wanders into Midian, and they know who the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is. It's interesting. When you get to Exodus 4, remember the famous or infamous bridegroom of blood episode where God, wants to kill Moses, and then Zipporah has to save the day, and there's something going on, with circumcision. Again, we'll get to that too, but she knows. She's the daughter of the priest of Midian. She knows that circumcision is a big deal. Again, that's right out of the religion of the patriarchs. So again, it's very consistent. It's very consistent, even though, again, it requires us to think a little bit differently about some things. Now, to wrap up our episode, just a couple of other things. Let's look at Zipporah. In verse 21, her name means bird, a bird. Again, it's either a term of endearment or to reflect, her beauty. Verse 22, we get Gershom. Gershom has an interesting meaning. Zipporah gives birth to a son. Moses, called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Gershom, again, comes from the main stem of the word is garash, which means to drive out or to drive off. Okay, it's the same lemma used to describe the action of the shepherds in verse 17. Okay, when the daughters of the priest of Midian, are being driven off, the shepherds came and drove them away. It's the same lemma there, garash, to drive away. And it's kind of interesting that Moses, of course, witnesses this while he's in a foreign land, and he has been driven out of Egypt. Again, he's forced to flee, by Pharaoh. So just the name of the son sort of harkens back to the occasion where Moses met his future wife and he was received into Jethro's family. But Gershom, Sarna points out, also carries a wider national allusiveness. That's ALL, like an allusion. Its allusions are bigger. For later in the narrative, the stem is used 3 more times. Garash is used 3 more times to underscore the abject humiliation of the stubborn Pharaoh as he is forced to reverse his refusal to let Israel go. Again, later on in the story, again, he drives them out. In other words, the term's going to be picked up by the writer just to draw connections between Moses being driven away and Moses rescuing these women from the shepherds. Shepherds who were driving them away, and then of course the name of Moses' own son. There's an interconnectedness, throughout these characters and these scenes. The folk etymology, Sarna says, interprets the name as a composite of ger, sham, a stranger. There, ger is stranger. Sham is the word for there. And so we get this, I've been a sojourner in a foreign land. That statement is still true because Moses was driven out. But again, scholars have pointed out that what we actually have here is the lemma garash, to drive out, and it's used intertextually in a number of other episodes here. Verses 23 through 24, or the end, through 25, we read, during those many days, the king of Egypt died. Again, when we were discussing chronology earlier, you cannot say that you have the same Pharaoh who was the Pharaoh of the oppression and the one who was seeking Moses' life, and have the same guy be the Pharaoh of the Exodus, because he dies. Right here it is. Again, I don't want to rehearse that, but this is something that needs to be accounted for, and it's kind of astonishing how many treatments of the chronology, the candidate for Pharaoh, just omit this or just never seem to see it. Again, I don't know how that is, but it's true. I can show you specific examples of pretty good published stuff, and it's not in there. There, continuing in Exodus 2 in verse 23. So the king of Egypt died. The people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. That's the way it ends. And God knew. He knew what? I mean, haven't you ever wondered that? You get to the end of Exodus 2, and God knew. What? I mean, it feels like there's something that should come after that. The best answer is probably found in Exodus 3, 7 through 8a, at least the first part of A, because it aligns with the third-person narration of Exodus 2, 23 through 24. So if we read Exodus 3, 7, and 8, then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know, and here we get what God knows, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and bring them out of that land, so on and so forth. So what God knows is what's happening to his people. And that's what we read, in Exodus 2, 23 and 24. It's just odd that verse 25 ends that way. God saw the people of Israel and God knew. It's really abrupt, but that's what it is. Now, as far as literary stuff, and we'll end with this, I mean, we've sort of picked around a few of the problems in the passage and a few of the things that we're going to be picking up in later episodes with Exodus 3 and beyond. But there's some real interesting literary things going on. I just want to read a summary by Hughes in the Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch. I think he has a really nice way of summarizing kind of literarily what's going on in this passage. He writes, Ruel's significance is further emphasized by the fact that he is properly named Ruel, meaning friend of God, in Exodus 2:18, which provides a sharp contrast to the oppressive anti-creational bent of the Pharaoh, who has just been described as seeking to kill Moses. So Ruel, the friend of God, God's companion, is set in contrast to Pharaoh. One is the friend of God and the friend of Moses. The other one wants to kill him. The hospitality of the priest toward Moses, the outsider, not only contrasts with Pharaoh and his banishment of Moses from Egypt, but also serves to illustrate the impending legal concern for upholding the cause of those on the margins of Israelite society. Again, Carpenter gets into the foreshadowing of all this. He writes this: the conclusion in verse 22 and the previous context, including Genesis 15:13 and Genesis 50:24 through 25. Again, verse 22 is the reference to Gershom, and that Moses was a sojourner, a stranger in a foreign land. These things work together to indicate Moses' status in Midian is ultimately temporary, and to anticipate an open door for him to return to Egypt to lead Israel to their own land of inheritance. The event of Moses' deliverance, think of the word deliverance. The event of Moses' deliverance of Ruel's daughters foreshadows not only Exodus 18, but the entire episode in Exodus 18:1 through 12. In incipient form, it is Moses who informs Ruel or Jethro of Yahweh in chapter 18, not the other way around. This scenario, involving meeting one's bride at a well, recalls similar scenes in Genesis 24:12 through 16 with Isaac and Rebekah, Genesis 29:1 through 14 with Jacob and Rachel. All of these episodes stress the providential care of God for the persons involved, but in this case, it is Moses' exile and sojourn in Midian that is the most important. Moses' act of kindness had ramifications that he did not expect, but the reader will recall that he had been a favored baby, Exodus 2:2, a status that also applies to him as an adult. That special status is revealed powerfully in the functions God places on Moses, God's chosen leader. And that's the end of the quote. Again, what he's saying here is that the whole thing, Moses winds up in Midian. Again, you've got the association with Zion, you've got the kings of Midian. He's running from Pharaoh, but what happens to him? He runs into the friend of God, Ruel, and he is taken in by that family. He delivers. Okay, he delivers, and the word there is the same as you're going to get with deliverance elsewhere in the Exodus story. But he delivers the women from these hostile shepherds who are driving them away from the water. Again, it foreshadows the deliverance that Moses is going to be the agent of for the entire nation. And really, it foreshadows even more than that, with salvation of God's people, later on in the New Testament. He is a stranger, in a foreign land. He's been driven out, and he refers to the driving out. I mean, all these things are to make you to connect in your mind Moses, Egypt, Midian, Ruel, all those things with what's going to happen later. Specific episodes, specific deliverances, specific places, specific people, ultimately that Moses is going to be involved in. So there are these little seed words and seed thoughts in the last few verses, really 16 through 25 of Exodus 2, that sort of set the stage. They become little springboards or little, jumping off points for the story as it's going to unfold later on, because some of the same verbiage is going to be used you'll have seen it before, and it'll take your mind back here in some clever ways. So I just wanted to throw that in because, again, I like intertextuality. If you don't, well, I'm sorry. But I like intertextuality because, again, the biblical writers are intelligent. They drop things, little breadcrumbs, words, phrases, imagery, because they want you to connect ideas in the present, what you're reading, and they also want you to remember them when you get to other places in what they're writing, and you can see how one thing foreshadowed the other. I think it's just interesting to be able to trace those things through. So next time we will hit Exodus 3. We've got a lot to talk about. Horeb, Sinai, Midian, the revealing of the name. Again, there's a lot of stuff there that we've sort of seen the precursor of already here, and it's not It's not going to be unique to Exodus. There's going to be a lot of that going on in the book.